got that part right. I think most of you will know me as the Civil Contingencies Coordinator, others when I was a former commanding officer of the Royal Gibraltar Regiment, but I suspect many of you won't know much about me. So I just wanted to start off today just sharing a little secret with you. Firstly, when I was a child, I didn't really think about a career in the army. Actually, all I wanted to be was a police officer. Brought up in police barracks. My father was in the police. My grandfather was in the police. The natural thing for me was to follow those footsteps. But when I turned 18, there wasn't any vacancies to join the police force. On the other hand, I could see my brother Edgar, who was in the Royal Gibraltar Regiment, and he had the perfect lifestyle. He was going away with all his friends and had lots. He was fit, and he just seemed to have the greatest time of his life. At that point, I said, I'll go, this is the type of life that I want. Unfortunately, I never did any of the homework, given that I'd never been in the Scouts, never done the Air Training Corps, really didn't know what the Army was about. But I just packed my bags and off I went for 6 months military training at the Queen's Division Depot in Basenbourne. The other big problem I had was that I was very much mummy's boy. Mum did everything for me, cooking, ironing, washing, and so on. And I had no preparation whatsoever. So just imagine the shock I had as soon as I arrived there to do my training. And let me just tell you, there was a very steep learning curve for me. Fortunately, within the first day, I had all my hair shaved. So at least I knew that quitting was not going to be an option, because by the time I allowed my hair to grow, I actually then started to realize that I did love the army and study everything that the military brought for me. So from there, obviously, never looked back at that decision. Certainly shows that sometimes in life you don't know what's going to come, and sometimes it's not that bad. When I came back to the regiment, just took every single opportunity I had of going away, overseas training exercises, doing courses and everything else. I was single at the time, so there wasn't certainly any other thing that I could do. Things were going really well. Ended up getting selected to go for Army Officer Commission, which later went to Sanders, completed that training, returned back to Gibraltar, taken over a platoon, and again had a brilliant first few years. By the end of '98, things then changed a little bit. By that stage, I meet a girl. 10 months later, I then get married. The funny thing was that within those, or out of those 10 months, I probably spent half of the time away. Just flicking forward, because I've just remembered that I stopped. That is me on the left-hand side, probably my first picture, certainly without any hair. Hence, now you understand why I stayed until the end of the 6 months. When I got married, I had the perfect honeymoon. 2 days after getting married, I had all the expenses paid for. So I left my wife behind and then went straight onto an operation posting to Northern Ireland. Spent the millennium over there, and it wasn't until a few months later that then my wife actually comes and joins me in UK for our first house together. I had a great time over there. It was a great posting. I went over from Northern Ireland afterwards to ITC Catterick, where I took over the quarter, and my wife joined me. At the time, there was an instructor at the Infantry Training Centre for 2 years, so a brilliant two years. By September 2001, we were packing, getting ready to return back to Gibraltar for our next posting, but then this happened. And I'm sure you all remember the September the 11th attack. At the time, like everybody here, that you were alive at that point, will remember there was a very significant event. And I remember being struck by this news headline of the Economist News Weekly, saying the day the world changed, because I certainly being in the military, I said, what's going to come next? And then we knew that a few weeks after the war in Afghanistan started, then by the beginning of 2003, the war in Iraq started. And that very much was shaping the military in terms of those being the two major conflicts that they were focusing on. Certainly, my opportunity, as indeed many of my colleagues in the regiment later deployed, came in in 2007 when I then deployed over to Afghanistan as a company commander responsible for the training of army officers in the Afghan National Army. The bottom picture you can see, they didn't come with me, obviously, but that is my wife and then 2-year-old son that obviously just stayed behind. In my first few days of being in Afghanistan, then get a phone call from my wife and just saying, just to let you know, I'm expecting another baby as well. So when I finished my 7 months over there, returned back to Gibraltar, imagine the shock I had to find a much larger wife than I last left her. But maybe on the plus side, the good news was that I only had about 1 month left of going for those antojitos or cravings that you normally have to. Coming back to the point I made earlier about the day the world changed, clearly it didn't just change for me as a person, it certainly changed for the whole world in terms that the world did become a much more dangerous place. I'm sure we all remember as well that shortly after that, we had Al-Qaeda exporting its attacks into Europe. So we saw the Madrid bombings, the London bombings in 2005. Later on, we then see ISIS coming from 2015 onwards. That picture, I know it's going to be difficult for all of you to see, but let us not forget what happened in 16, 17, Manchester Arena bombings, the Paris attacks, and everything else. I think much of this also characterized our time in the regiment, in the military, as indeed all the emergency services, everyone very much focused on internal security issues. And by the time that I came to the end of my 25-year career in the Army in 2017, an opportunity then comes up into civil contingencies, which I moved on. I think it was a great job, certainly for me, really pleased, especially that I still managed to continue my contacts with both the military and the other emergency services. But if you don't know what civil contingencies mean, perhaps the easiest thing for me to explain it is, I'll use 2 words, depressing and challenging. Depressing in the fact that much of our time is spent looking at what can go horribly wrong and then trying to plan for those, working with with all the other partners in trying to not make it so bad. In many ways, I think that we can be seen as the oil in the engine, where you're trying to get all the key components trying to work together and get moving. The other thing I would say is that not only are you just dealing with all your traditional risks, such as a major accident, natural hazards, or indeed animal diseases, as we'll later find out, but even the non-traditional risks, such as who would have thought that in 2018, 2016, when UK voted to leave the EU, that 2 years later, when I started in this job, I would then form part as well of a team looking at the no-deal consequences. Anyway, coming forward to a few years already in the office, by January 2020, we know what happened, and we started the year quite busy, a very busy to-do list. At the end of that month, we had an LNG or an exercise to test the LNG facility. The following month, we were also planning a much larger live exercise, testing a terrorist scenario. But at the time that we were all in the office there with our colleagues, we had a story in the background. That story is all about this mystery illness that then started in Wuhan, in China. At the time, obviously, it was a concern. It was interesting. But then we realized as the day went on, this story didn't get away. And actually, the consequences and the seriousness of this became even more evident. By the 20th of January, we were already scheduled to meet with the GHA to look at a tabletop exercise, to look at these type of events. But clearly, we very much focus on having a chat about Wuhan. It was very obvious from the word go that we were facing something quite significant. So much so that probably our government was one of the first to really get things in motion. And by the 27th of January, the government had established a strategic coordinator group. That, in effect, is a group that really focuses on things that you normally have for major incidents. That SCG that was chaired by Minister for Civil Contingency, Samantha Sacramento, together with the other ministers for public health and health, was very much focused on knowing, okay, what are we facing, what are vulnerabilities, what we need to do. And when we came to our scenario, and I'm sure you remember that we already were seeing what was happening in China, later on in Italy and onwards, but it was a pretty alarming scenario. I mean, these are things that I never really thought that we would be facing in the 21st century. And I think what was obvious to us was that this was going to be life-changing. And if the world was going to change, certainly this was going to be it. We're talking about 60 to 80% of the whole world population being infected. Of those, 3% of people requiring hospitalizations, and of those, about 5% will end up in critical care, probably on ventilators. And sadly, about 1% looking at death. And particularly the other concern was that we are talking about this affecting mainly your people in the higher age brackets. When we come across to vulnerabilities, the first one is the obvious one, which is we only have one hospital, 150 beds, of which 80% or so is already occupied. So already, given the numbers that we're talking about, and we're talking about hundreds of people requiring hospitals, there wasn't really enough capacity to deal with that. Secondly, we're talking about limited equipment. This is a kind of illness that will require your ventilator support and so on. And there was a push across the whole world trying to get these items of equipment, PPE, and so on. The other issue that you had was our border security, our points of entry, the fact that Wuhan, China may have seemed to be very far away, but the reality was that it wasn't. We live in a very interconnected world where the Wuhan football team were training in sort of around in January of that year, as you probably remember. The fact that Chinese and other people from the Asian countries were coming quite freely into Gibraltar from across in Spain, and even our workforce that mainly worked in the gaming companies on, some of whom were from that region, were in China for the New Year's celebration, about to return to Gibraltar. So already we see that we were quite vulnerable. The other point I'll make is that even the other concern was that the border with Spain, if we had our first case confirmed here in Gibraltar, there was a chance we would see a repeat of the MV Aurora in 2003, where Spain would close or shut the border, and what would have that meant for our key workers and for our supplies. So in terms of what needed to be done, in terms of our strategy, it was all about buying time. We're not going to stop this, but you need to buy time to get the preparations in place. Secondly, once the virus comes over here, it's then going on to containment, making sure that you're trying to stop the spread of that virus and making sure that you're flattening the curve, as we were calling it, making sure that we are not overwhelming our health services and at least give the GHA a fighting chance to be able to deal with the patients. Our journey to lockdown, I can just see that it's very small for you. But all I'll say is that by the end of January, it was very clear that the world had lost control over this virus and it was spreading everywhere. The whole month of February, we saw how things were getting worse. Government was then introducing legislation to put in restrictions in certain countries, making sure we were quarantining people as they were coming in from those areas. And then we can see how our first case came in, cases started to spread, and then clearly we went into lockdown. In terms of a response, that had to be overnight. Those structures were put in place that we had been practicing, all coordinated through the civil contingencies and reported to the strategic coordinator group. We saw about the Gibraltar Health Authority stepping up. Later on, we saw 111 facility being created, and then that was followed by testing facilities and indeed the contact tracing bureau. Nightingale Hospital, we needed to have a capacity of 300 more beds. The great work that Stuart Benson did in record time to have this facility set up. Public Information Call Centre, we needed to have one central point where people could come in and get any support that they require. And indeed, the response teams working through the care agency, given all the support they had. And in terms of the amount of volunteers that came over, given the time, so we could help those most vulnerable. The Ministry of Environment as well, increasing capacity in terms of the cemetery, all dire staff. But the fact is that we needed to do all this. Isolation facilities, protecting our people, run by John Rodriguez. scrambling for PPE. At the time, the whole world just wanted to get PPE, and clearly, I've run out of time. And even having our own Gibraltar pilot going over to China on 2 trips, making sure that we had all that. International support as well, lots of repatriations that certainly we had to bring those Gibraltarians back in, and certainly we saw that in Morocco. Okay, and then we were hit by the deadly wave. And I think that very much shows that even when you think that you're in control, the worst can happen. And on that note, before I finish, because I've gone over time, the last thing I would want to say is thanks to all our healthcare professionals, everyone that worked in the CCU, ERS and so on, because without their support, we would have certainly not been able to get out in the way that we did.